I don't actually have any sort of like or dislike of Putin. I just have a
Seems like you have a kind of personal attitude toward Putin. You don't like him very much.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like not liking a vicious dog. I mean, so, I don't actually have any, like when I was growing up, next door neighbors had this German Shepherd that was wild and barking and biting and doing all this kind of stuff. And everyone just sort of wanted to like not have trouble with the dog. And it would be better that the dog wasn't our next door neighbor. I don't actually have any sort of like or dislike of Putin. I just have a distaste for what, he's a dangerous, destructive man that needs to be contained. It's not a question of emotions, it's a question of pure practicality.
Well, but there's also some kind of personal factor, I guess. It seems like you started dirty work, they took advantage of it, and then they kicked you out of business, trying to put you in jail and take your money. Isn't it a kind of personal attitude toward it?
I don't really take that personally at all. I tell you what I do take personally. So I think of these people as almost being savages. These are like cannibals. If you go into the jungle and you see cannibals, they come from the jungle. But the thing I do take personally are the Westerners who have full knowledge of the way these Russians behave, and also have the morals and upbringing of like right and wrong and religion and so on in the West, that do their dirty work in the courts and the PR and the investigations and so on, the banks. Those are the people that I really have trouble with. Those are the ones I have like visceral dislike towards. Sort of the cannibals, I kind of look at them as like people that need to be contained and rounded up and stopped. But the Westerners, those are the ones that they know better.
At the time, President Obama was resetting the relations with Russia. You think it was a wise political move?
I think it was a disastrous political move. Probably one of the most historically disastrous political moves. When we see what Putin is going to do in the future, which is going to be really bad stuff, we're going to look back on Obama and Hillary Clinton and their red reset button as we did on Neville Chamberlain's waving around the letter saying that we're going to have peace in Europe that he got from Adolf Hitler.
And you think that those sanctions put on Russia because of the war, are they successful in a way? They are just feeding his paranoia toward West, or feeding the propaganda of paranoia toward West?
Well, it depends what you mean by are they effective. Are the sanctions changing Putin's behavior? The answer is no. Would Putin change his behavior if there weren't sanctions? No. Do sanctions create a cost for Putin in the future? Yes. And the bigger the sanctions, the greater the cost. And in my opinion, the purpose of sanctions should not be to try to change his behavior. The purpose of the sanctions should be to take away resources from him that he would be using to be an aggressor in the West. We should basically be trying to sort of cut off his resources, like you would do with the terrorists. The idea that terrorists are busy blowing up buildings and being suicide bombers, we're not trying to change their behavior, we're trying to take away their resources. And that's the same thing you have to do with Putin.
And you think that he's cut off right now?
Well, you have two things happening. One is that oil prices have dropped by nearly 50%, which is his lifeblood. And two, the European Union and the United States have imposed sanctions which make it impossible for Russian companies to refinance their loans in the West. And there's more than 600 billion of loans. Those loans have to be refinanced in Russia, and the central bank doesn't have 600 billion of reserves. And so in 2 years' time, Putin will run out of money unless they find some other source of money.
And what will happen then? He will be replaced by someone more efficient?
Well, first of all, we don't know whether Putin will be replaced at all. I mean, the most likely scenario is the Mugabe scenario, where he somehow stays in power despite all this. Then there's the possibility that he gets replaced by his own people, by the Siloviki, the law enforcement people. And then there's also the Yanukovych scenario, where the people of Russia, because of something we can't predict, one incident which just blows up, and then the Russian people replace him. We don't know. Nobody knows. He doesn't know. That's the worst thing, is he doesn't know. And he's a very paranoid little man. And so he's trying to do everything he can to bolster his defenses right now in the hopes that it doesn't happen.
And there is no prominent fugitive Russian oligarch who could be a patron of any opposition movement. Why is that?
Well, Putin sucks out all the oxygen out of the opposition movement, and the most obvious thing is the murder of Boris Nemtsov. Putin has in my opinion, I think Putin was behind the murder of Boris Nemtsov. And I think he did it for one very specific reason, which was to terrorize everybody who was in the opposition. The assumption before was that if you're an opposition politician, you'll go to jail. With the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the assumption is if you're an opposition politician, you'll be killed. That's a much bigger disincentive to becoming an opposition politician.
Right now we see that Russia in international politics starts to behave like those prison guards in front of Magnitsky. How would you describe Russia's state today?
Well, so I think, first of all, that there's this expression, the canary in the coal mine. And people take these little canaries down to the coal mine to see if there's methane gas. And if the canary falls over, then all the miners quickly exit the mine. And I think that the Magnitsky story and my story was the canary in the coal mine, that we were evidence of what was going wrong in Russia.
I'm going to ask about Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was one of the prominent oligarchs in Yeltsin times. Then he fell off favors, and we all know how it ended for him. So I'm going to ask, what do you think about making him as a kind of martyr of democracy and free market in Russia? Is it correct? He was one of those bad guys.
Well, so he and I have had a very rocky relationship with highs and lows and highs again. So in the 1990s, he was one of the most rapacious oligarchs, meaning that he had the sharpest elbows, and I was a tiny investor in his big company. And so when he was first arrested, even though he wasn't arrested for anything he did badly to me, I was at that moment in time I was pleased. I was pleased that one of my biggest enemies in the business world had been taken down. Now, it has subsequently emerged that the reason that Putin took him down was not because he was a bad majority shareholder in oil companies, but Putin took him down to, one, take down the biggest oligarch who was challenging Putin's power, and two, was to send a message to every other oligarch that Putin wanted to become their business partner and wanted a portion of their assets. But eventually, people in Russia started getting angry, and they started getting angrier and angrier. And then Putin saw what happened to a much smaller version of himself, Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian people tossed him out. And Putin understood that if he didn't do something very quickly to change people's anger and redirect it somewhere else, that he was going to end up getting overthrown. And so what does he do? He does what has been done for hundreds of years in the past by leaders who are insecure when they want to change the direction.